Peace, everybody. Let me make sure my joint is on Do Not Disturb because we got some things to talk about. It is I, the Emma, aka Energy Masta Allah, and we are continuing with Decoding the Matrix. This is part 6. If you haven't seen the other 5, make sure you do that, or else you might be lost because I'm gonna jump right into it. When we left off on the previous one, we were talking about this thing, the meander, and this shape and the significance of it, and we identified this particular line of code that has something to do with Enki from the the Anunnaki and the Sumerian, the Mesopotamian stories and whatnot. So we're gonna go ahead and end that cliffhanger. We're gonna dive right into it. Try to get through this real quick. So I'm gonna go right to the whiteboard, but make sure that you also subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check out all those videos. Make sure you're checking out the AI deep dives. One of these Decoding the Matrixes is up currently with the different time stamps, so you can jump to one subject or another. I will be doing that with the others as well, but I'm just trying to get through these lives, make sure we get through the whole thing I want to transmit to you, and then we're gonna go from there. Boom, boom. All right, here we go. Turning it around. Okay, we got our whiteboard. Okay, I'll give you a sec. I don't think I gave you a chance. Yes, with the last broadcast to screenshot that. These slides will be available. I want once I'm done with everything, I do want to turn all of these whiteboards that I'm doing into actual one document that you can have all together. You can use as a guide if you want to go back through the videos. Realize you're getting a few hours with these combined teachers, so it's enough for almost a college course, and that's kind of the idea. I want this to turn into something that I will be using and teaching when the museum is finished. I'm helping to create the Gifford Historical Museum and Cultural Center here in my hometown, so be on the lookout for that. All right, so when we last left off, we were talking about this line, which was the 16th line in these tables we constructed with the golden ratio. And so we have this 51481190190. And so numerically, alphanumerically, 5 is E, 1 is A, 4 is D, alternatively 14 is N, 8 is H, 1 again is A, but 11 alternatively it can be K, 9 is I, but alternatively 19 can be S. We got 0, which is going to serve as our O. Another 1 of 19 there. 8 is H and O. So we'll get into what that is. So in the last one, we were also talking about the 432 and the arrangement of those positions on with the pyramids of Giza. So we identified this Vesica Pisces shape that began on the left to the west at the Menkaure pyramid, which represented Horus in the Sphinx riddle, and then I identified Albatran to the east, about 15-16 minutes. I think it's exactly 16 minutes. Interestingly enough, I have to look that up. But it is representative of a tomb, the old man, and then I identified in the center, near the top, what would correspond to Ra, because he was the 2. So the child Horus was the 4, Atum, the old man, was the 3, and Ra was the 2. So in doing that, 432 would actually give you, so Horus is HR, Atum is that TM, and then the R is that Ra. So that gives us 2 words, Hut and Mer. So Hut, among other things, can mean female. It could be basically a female Horus. So Horus was a type of title that they would give royalty in Egypt. But then we're talking about a female Horus, which was a concept I hadn't heard before that, but then apparently that also applies to Hathor. Okay, and then Hathor, she's involved in that cow imagery. You know, we talked about Zeus and Io being turned into a cow, and then the two of them were considered the grandparents of the Ethiopians. So that's an interesting thing to pop up here with this 432. But the other thing that it means is queen, and then Mer, among other things, means pyramid. And interestingly enough, in that same dynasty, the same word for pyramid meant basically a pile of corpses. So if you look at a pyramid and you imagine instead that that pyramid is made out of dead bodies, apparently that was a thing in Egypt. So you can make whatever you want out of that, but that's just to give you that context. Now this number 432 is fascinating because I applied that to, we talked about our Fibonacci sequence, our golden ratio in the last video. And so I talked a little bit about Drunvalo Melchizedek, and then what he was talking about with the consciousness, saying that there was a ship under the pyramid, like Thoth had a ship under there. He was talking about how there is basically these 9 spheres underground at the where the pyramids are, and it has something to do with the human consciousness and how it works. And one of the other things that Drunvalo happened to bring up was that the human Merkaba, so the soul vehicle, the light vehicle, it isn't some thing outside of yourself. It's the means by which you are able to navigate your field and be able to grab information. I see the guy on here, Peace Prince. I see you. Pray him in the building. All right, but so this 34/21, if you notice, it is the only one of those Fibonacci sequence pairs that has in sequence the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. So in sequential order. So you can look at that as kind of a circle. So we can either count that as 1, 2, 3, 4 or 4, 3, 2, 1. So that 432 hertz, that's the frequency from the pyramid itself, or whatever, we see that represented in here. So we see that going counterclockwise. All right. And then counterclockwise, as we established earlier, has to do with spirituality, the idea of going in, reconnecting to the other side. And the counterbalance to that would be resurrection, which is to say, coming back here, if you will. Well, if we take that at 432 and then we keep going backwards to that 1 and then incorporate that 0, we can look at that as one cipher, so one circle. Well, remember that 4, that 3, and that 2, we said that represented Horus, Atum, and Ra. Okay, so each of them represent different positions in the sky of the sun. So Horus, since he's the baby or the child, he would be the sun in the morning. Ra would be the sun at noon, and then Atum, the old man, would be the sun in the evening. So we look at that 432, one cipher is a day. Now the word day, its root comes from the same root as deity. So there, you constantly see this connection between deities and day. So even when you in the Lord's Prayer, when it talks about give us this day our daily bread, there's a little more being said that give us God our godly and I forget what the etymology of bread was, but it's something like look through that. So if you're not familiar with the Lord's Prayers in Matthew, New Testament, and then just kind of break down each of those words, remember that it was originally written in Greek. So if you look at, they call it a transliteration. If you look at a Greek transliteration, something you could just type in on Google and search, then you'll find that, hold on, something got erased on my board. Let me make sure I still got it. I don't know how that happened. I know what it is, though. I don't know how that got erased. There's some funny business. I see a thumb right there. It was either mine or somebody else's. But we all good. All right, we got a ways before we get to that anyway. All right. So anyway, so day and deity. So just keep that in mind. 360-degree rotation. Keep all that in mind. All right. So we going back the other way. So we said that was counterclockwise. So clockwise. All right. So if we did that same thing, so if we take that 1, we put it in the beginning with that oh, looks like a 10. We can still use it as a cipher, but then more importantly, we got this 2, 3, 4. So we go in the other direction. Now, right there, we see that we actually got some letters right there. So 23 is W and 4 is D. Now, of course, when you have the D with that line under it, that's called a diacritic. So whenever you add a little symbol to a letter or whatever, that's called a diacritic. And in this particular case, that makes that D make a just sound like a J kind of. So it's DJ. And this is pronounced wedge. And wedge in Egyptian means to command, assign, things like that. And it also means a stela. So a stela is an obelisk, just like the Axum obelisk in Ethiopia that we talked about, and in the Washington Monument in DC, that's a stela as well. Now, what jumped out at me, and I can't even remember what it was specifically I was looking at that made me realize this, but I was like, oh, if that's command, maybe this can signify the 10 Commandments. Because at one point, it occurred to me that based on the process by which, going back to the etymology of God, which I've covered extensively throughout these videos, God comes from a word that means that which is invoked, meaning voice that's called in. We've related that to phonon impressions in the structure of the body. So the sounds that you make and the sounds that you send into your body through chant or other means, they do store information throughout the body. And so it appeared when I reviewed the story, given the context, and then looking at the etymology of the words that they used in the biblical story, it appeared that that Moses, wherever he was, assuming that it's even a person, because each of their names has a significance as well in the overall story, but assuming that there was a flesh and blood person being represented in that situation, they went to that mountain, and it would appear that they made a connection related to their meditation that allowed him to bring it down. And the other things I pointed out in that conversation were the fact that Moses, his name in one respect translates to reed, like the reeds in within a river like that you see growing out of swamp or marsh or rivers or things of that nature. And then they say that's because he was in a reed basket in the story. But his name and variations of that name also mean moor. And see, the word moor can also mean swamp and things of that nature. And the reason that the idea of Moorish or Moor being associated with black people came along was because these rivers, when they were slower, these bodies of water where they didn't really drain like that, the different vegetation and stuff in the river would mix, and then the water would become murky and dark or whatever. So there was always a relationship between the darkening of water and the people who lived around it. All right, so that's how you end up with that. And so, but long story short, in addition to Moses's name seemingly being related to a thing that you used to write, because they made pens out of reeds. So you had calamari or squids or whatever, their ink was added to a reed in order to make a pen. And then you would write on paper. They would write on papyrus, which was also a reed paper. And so this is where we get that link between read as R-E-E-D and then read as in R-E-A-D, read a book. Okay. And so that's what had me realize that there may be more to the idea of a Torah. And based on the work of Stan Tannen and the Merrill Foundation and him discovering that the Hebrew letters are based on these certain shapes, these shadows in fire that could be imitated with the positions of the hands, it occurred to me that the Torahs could very well be our hand. Like we as dark-skinned people had the unique feature of not just having lines on our hands, but then we've got certain lines highlighted that are dark. And so that is like a roadmap. It tells very specific information. Like in a previous video, I've broken down how my heart line, how it's split right here into a V Over in India, they call that the mark of Vishnu. So I had the mark of Vishnu on my heart, and it has a significance over there. So it basically, your hands tell a whole story based on which ones are darkened. And so you get this idea of 10 commandments. It's not just 10 things that somebody is telling somebody else to do, but in the context of what I just said, it would seem that these are mudras, so different hand positions that we're talking about, 10 hand positions that serve as commands for the machinery of the body. So when you send vibration through your body and you're holding mudras in a proper way, it has different effects on the way that electricity travels through the body. And if you change the way that electricity is traveling through the body, you also change the way that the magnetic fields are set up. And the magnetic fields hold memory. DNA holds memory. So you are affecting all sorts of circuits within your body. You are the most advanced machine in the physical universe. Hands down, you're a microcosm of the whole universe. And so those commands are facilitated by the hands. The hands are attached to the heart channel. So in Chinese thought and in India, the heart chakra, which governs both the heart and lungs, is also the hands are an extension of it. So the heart projects a magnetic field, an electromagnetic field from the body in the shape of a torus, so like a donut. And the positions of your hands, by altering the positions of your hands, this alters certain aspects of the electromagnetic field, which in turn has an effect on your body and your environment. Okay, so this idea of 10 commandments or 10 commands, and then also having stellas. So stellas are obelisks. They're these long, tall structures. Well, that sounds like fingers. So it's like it's telling you that your fingers serve as these stellas. So they basically serve the same function on your hand that these tall obelisks play around the world. So they said that they were part of some kind of energy system that worked with the pyramids or whatever else. And you hear the stuff about the jed pillars or whatever. Well, you got some built-in jed pillars right here on your hand that help to regulate equilibrium in the body. All right. And so let's see. And if you look at it, okay, so with my fingers, I got 1 position here, 2 position here, 3 position here, 4 position here. And then I can do the same on the other side, other hand. So that's 8. But then I've got positions where I can put the 2 thumbs together. So that's a total of 9. Now I got 10 fingers, but 9 key positions. And that's important as we move to the next one, because remember that arrangement of Horus, Atum, and Ra from the riddle of the Sphinx is actually in the order of 4, 2, 3, because 4 would be in the morning, 2 would be in the afternoon, and then at noon would be Ra, and then in the evening would be Atum, the old man. So that's 423. Okay, so what is the significance of this? Okay, so when we put it in that order, we get Horatum, like this, which means in Heret. So blossom. So one meaning of Heret is blossom, and then we already established that is the same etymology of Thales of Miletus, the guy that we covered in the other videos, whose name has something to do with blood and the permittivity of said blood. So the ability of blood to form a dielectric to allow electric current to move through the body. It uses the cells as well as the electrolytes in the body, the salts in the body, in order to send waves of electricity and information throughout the body from the heart. Okay. Now the other meaning of Heret happens to be a hostile snake of the Duat. Okay. So what this is, so Duat is alternatively spelled Tuat with a T. And this is basically in science, they call it the Calabi Yau space, but we'll just call it kind of like subspace. And this is where vibrations basically weave together in different patterns before they manifest as the physical particles that you see. And so when you see these snakes, essentially what they're talking about is these different vibrations, but more importantly, in string theory, they talk about membranes, so D brains. The D is short for Dirichlet. He was a guy that, came up with these various theorems and, discovered it for the West. That don't mean that there weren't already systems that knew about it. It was just that as far as the accepted sciences of the West goes, he's the guy credited with that one. And so in this case, we're talking about hostile snakes. So you'll hear in various, whether it be the mythologies or the ufology, where you've got a huge reptilian racism problem, which is to say that there are countless reptilian soul races. That don't mean they're necessarily physically walking around. Maybe not. But at least on the soul level, there's several different reptilian races, and all signs point to the fact that there's very much a reptilian race that's important to the human evolution, but there's also several others, one in particular that is the one that everybody's like scared of or says causes the trouble on Earth. And it was, of course, in their best interest to confuse the difference between them and the ones we're actually related to, because then you could trick people into doing things, saying like, oh yeah, we're your friends or whatever, we're your family or whatever else. And then on the other hand, you can demonize the queen mothers. That's where the queen comes in. And, we're not about to act like everybody's all good or whatever else. But at the same time, the way the story goes is that, they ruled with an iron fist for a good while, but then they realized that was bad for business, and they started embracing things like the arts and stuff like that. So they just learned how to rule differently. But once again, you had these other rebel factions, these other reptilians, and you have, there's like a hierarchy, like a classism almost in some cases, where you've got the elites, the dragons, the top shelf ones who are like more civilized and actually taught humanity. Those are more closely related to us. But then you've got the warrior class up under them. That's the ones that are causing most of the trouble. And then below that, you've got it's a more primitive kind of reptile. And they say that the dinosaurs or whatever they're really supposed to be were actually a race of those, some of the lower class ones. So that is what it is. You can take it with a grain of salt, but just letting you know what the narrative is so you can piece stuff together yourself. Now, the other thing that HRRT means is Hereret. So Hereret is an obscure goddess. They don't know a lot about it except the fact that she's the one that controls the 12 snakes of the underworld, quote unquote, and what that represents is the 12 hours of night. So so anytime you see 12 or 13, like the one that's guiding the 12 or things of that nature, it's oftentimes dealing with either daytime or night, because once again, deities, we have a connection between day and deity. Okay. So we've got those aspects going on, but then because of that because M by itself in Egyptian means in. So we're talking about something that's inside. So this flow that's happening inside, the snakes that are inside. So we can look at daytime as what's happening outside the body, and then nighttime as what's happening inside the body, because the inside the body is dark unless you stick a light in your butt, right? So that's what your nighttime is. So anytime we're talking about underworld, we're talking about that which is inside of a structure. And then likewise, we've got this distinction between the gods of heaven, the ones that come from beyond the sky, whatever else. But then you've got this concept of like Anunnaki, they're from another world, underworld. So you've got the difference between the heavenly realm and the invisible realm that's right here on Earth. And basically what that gets into is really the difference between past and future, because you've got a set of, so as far as certain teachings go, particularly, I guess this is something that's kind of one of those new Wappy and Dr. York type of things, but I agree with it because it was something I was on to anyway. So when they talk about the Paa Najaru, aka the Netter, they're talking about something that's within you because they're ancestors. So that means that their existence interacts with you through your DNA as well as those charges in your body I was talking about. So those electrolyte charges, because your experience of reality is closely tied to the third ventricle, which is that liquid filled area in the center of your brain that facilitates communication between a number of important things at the center of your brain, including the pineal and the pituitary, and I think the hypothalamus is there that regulates your equilibrium in the body, so Jed pillar, quote unquote, and all these other things that's going on in there. But your whole experience of reality is largely facilitated with that third ventricle, aka the cave of Brahma. Okay, Brahma being the creator from the Hindu pantheon. Okay, and so they interact with you through those charges, right? So that's where you come from. All right, and so on the other end of that, you have invisible forces in the form of magnetic impressions, if you will, the field of the earth itself, the field within your body, and so on and so forth. So you have certain things that interact with you on that level and interact primarily with the soul body, because the soul body is able to experience more of the physical spectrum than your living body, your food body, if you will, that you're using right now while you're awake. Okay, so that's getting into a whole nother thing. Now, if you see here, okay, so we're talking about this one cipher. Now, the important image here, so remember up here, when we were going 4, 3, 2, 1 or whatever, we were going counterclockwise. Here we're talking about the resurrection, so how the 10 commandments, how you can, and then mind you, resurrection doesn't necessarily mean returning from physical death, so much as dying to your current personality and programming and then rebooting with a new program. And because you need that type of rebirth, and that determines what your possibilities are once you leave here as a soul. Like you're just shedding the gross body, but then you still have all of those same charges and things existing. And then this type of thing has been shown within water, like dissolving DNA in water, to where the arrangement of charges remained consistent even after the DNA was dissolved into the water, and then that information was translatable into electrical information that could be transported from one computer to another, and they were able to recreate the DNA in another water with a sugar solution in a lab that was several miles away. So that's one of those things you can check out on the, I think it's the Secret of Water, or the water, whatever's that documentary about Dr. Emoto, the one that did the test on how sound affects water. So it's that documentary. Anyway, so we got the counterclockwise, the clockwise. Now down here, in order for me to do 4, 2, 3, I'm going to have to go from this top corner to this bottom corner, up, and then to the 1, like this. So in other words, I'm making one of these infinity signs. Okay, so that tells you something right there. That's what we're dealing with. This, what is infinity? This cycle that keeps cycling and recycling itself. Okay, and so something that's commonly known is that particles, they don't just, for one complete cycle, I guess you'll say it, they actually have to go, it's actually 2 turns. It's a total of 720 degrees, because they kind of twist around themselves a certain way. And it's very much reminiscent of this infinity sign. If you're into tarot and all that good stuff, you'll know that that sign appears mainly and probably only amongst the major arcana. It appears on above the magician's head. So the magician is connecting with heaven in order to bring the elements down to earth. So in other words, it comes down as electromagnetic or Akashic impressions that are then translated into the four qualities that are associated with the four elements. And then that would be fire would be associated with willpower. Air would be associated with intellect. So it's basically the natural, connective, reactive system that facilitates the interaction between all the other elements. Then earth would be the container, or it could be the nature, so the inherent nature or template that everything is basing itself on. And then water would be the animating principle, so it would be the thing that flows through the body that actually gives it life. And then for all intents and purposes, we can look at that as electricity. I would say water itself, but even water itself is able to conduct electricity and do other things because of that inherent quality associated with the animating principle, that which makes things move. Okay, and so that it comes in through the top and then it gets distributed throughout the body. Now, interestingly enough, we see this same circulation in a number of places. You have the imagery of a giant serpent or dragon called Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail. So in other words, it's sustaining itself off of itself. And so that is basically a description of everything in the universe, because even though the matter has been differentiated enough to where that cheeseburger doesn't seem like it's you're all from the same source, so that we're all just this one thing that is consuming itself and then resurrecting itself, in different forms, different ways. So the laws of our sciences says that energy is neither created nor destroyed; it just gets repurposed. And so that's essentially what you're doing. All right. Now you see that this same winding, twisting, figure eight, infinity, whatever type of thing is happening with the diatom model that we shared in the first video. So in the first part of Decoding the Matrix, we talked about those little creatures, those little phytoplankton called the diatom, and their structure and their association with other geometric structures, and the way light and energy move through them. If you don't remember, because they're basically little plants at the end of the day, little living plant creatures, diatoms convert sunlight and carbon dioxide and stuff into sugars to provide food for itself. And so because it's dealing with light, it's a perfect, it's perfect that this shape and this orientation, as I have it here, that double cube, each one of those lines represents a square root of a number in order. So starting in that corner, So we'd have 0 would be a point, so 0 dimension, 0 point or whatever would correspond to the shortest wavelength, which would be violet in a rainbow if we split this up. This line 1, square root of 1, so square root of 0, square root of 1, which is 1, of course, corresponds to indigo, the third eye. The diagonal of a square is square root of 2, so that would give us our blue, our throat. This line from here to the other corner of the cube is the green, so that'd be square root of 3. This line down the side is 2 times this. So if this is 1, that's going to be 2, and then 2 is a square root of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Square root of 4 is our yellow, our solar plexus. From this corner to this corner, going across 2 squares in 2 dimensions, that's a square root of 5. So that's our orange, sacral chakra. Then finally, we got the 6, which is the far corner on the bottom to the far corner on the top over here on the other side. That'd be our red ray, so that'd be our root chakra. Red is the longest wavelength of visible light, okay? And so you see it goes up and over like this, but then it whips around and then comes back around like this. So it basically does that same figure 8. So even down on that level, you got this same thing happening, and this basically gives us an idea of what's really happening with on that subatomic quantum level of vibrations weaving themselves together before you even get any matter. Okay, so 10 days, it's 10 cycles. So we were talking about the 10 commandments. So we're bringing these two things together in the form of this. So instead of those two terms canceling each other out, we're making a chorus basically, because now we've got one going clockwise and we got one going counterclockwise. So going back and forth, so it goes clockwise and then counterclockwise, clockwise and counterclockwise. So if we're putting those two together, basically what we're saying is we're cycling three. We got a circle around each of these 10 digits, right? These commands. So we got a cycle for each one of those. So that is a total of 3,600 degrees. 3,600 degrees in this case also happens to be 5 times 720. 5 we associate with a star, so that 5-point star that is found in the both the symbols for Earth, that with respect to nature, your inherent nature. 5 is also associated with that star with regards to symbolism around Christ, as well as Allah, arm, leg, arm, head, 5 points. Okay, so we're talking about the man now. They got 72 degrees. So with the 360, we typically say that shows the power. 5 is power, 7 is God, 2 is wisdom. That's the power of God's wisdom. Now here is the power of God's wisdom adding a cipher. Okay, so a cipher is a person, place, thing. It's a cycle of life. It is a being. Okay, and so 10 times 360, that gives us that 3,600. Now the 10 deities. Now, like I said earlier, we had 9 positions that we can make with the fingers, even though we've got 10 fingers, and then that's because of how the thumbs are positioned. Now, interestingly enough, the word thumb, one of its roots is a word tomb, and so notice that a tomb, we spell it with just that TM, right? So tomb, so thumb. Now, what's interesting about the thumbs is that they say the thumbs aren't a finger. They serve a different purpose than the fingers do. And, and then there's a lot of things that you can't do if you don't have thumbs. That's what separates us from the animals. Now, in the case of a tomb, see, a tomb is a primordial deity. So he was considered without gender. He was considered to have basically created and constructed himself on that vibrational level before interacting with the physical space. And so upon coming into the physical space, and you have a couple of deities where the story is just like this, where he splits into 2. So you can look at it as being this one cipher that is composed of the 2 things, but then like this infinity sign, but then it divides into the 2 opposing sides, or complementary sides rather, which represent masculine and feminine. The masculine is the clockwise and the feminine is the counterclockwise. So as opposed to him having both of them, he split into the 2. And so this is how we end up with the other 8 deities in the pantheon. So you got 9 main deities in the pantheon of Egypt, and it's a tomb, and then his children, the children's children, so on and so forth, totaling 8. So this same kind of principle is mirrored in the Dogon mythologies with regards to Amma, and then creating a pneumo, and then the pneumo being split into 8 parts. So you had the one that became 8 for a total of 9. And so what you see happening here is that these 10 digits of your hands come together for 9 positions, and then the thumbs are 2 that are essentially 1. They come from one being that attuned. All right. So this is how that ends up translating into the hands. All right, and then this is your cross section. This is how the Egyptian, because we already know they have a similar chakra system and Kundalini and all that in Egypt. But then once again, Egypt and southern India were part of a single tradition that is associated with the original Ethiopia, not just the Ethiopia of today, but the overall culture of Ethiopia below the equator back in olden times. Now, the other thing is, so that Axum Stela, that particular obelisk in Ethiopia, I have to make a correction too. I was talking about the three languages that were translated. It wasn't on the Axum Stela itself, but on the Azana stone, which is a stone that was chiseled or at least dictated by an Axum king at that time, so King Azana or whatever. So that's what that was. But then it was the Axumite Empire. But anyways, in this case, that Stella in down there, it's either that one or the one in Heliopolis. They're both connected, but it had 12 levels to it, which is interesting because your fingers, if you look at it, each one of my fingers has 3 sections on it. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So just like that. So then that got me to thinking. I said, okay, well, what if I stack my fingers in order, like going from top to bottom, if I stack them smallest to biggest, right? And then I realized something. Let me do it with this hand. I realized something. So my first longest is here. Second longest is here. Third longest is here. Fourth longest is here. So in other words, 2, 1, 3, 4. Uh-oh. 2, 1, 3, 4. So what does that tell you about your hands and your fingers? It shows you that they are essential to this concept of a Merkaba, because when you go into your meditation and more importantly into your out-of-body experience, those mudras are basically what kind of guide you and allow you to have certain controls. Like when I was learning certain practices in both like Taoist arts as well as yogic arts and different things like that, sometimes I would find myself, like I would wake up and then realize that I was doing mudras in my sleep, and then it would do different things. Like it would heal me while I was asleep. It would just do, because your soul is taking over. And then it's basically whatever you need, you're still able to do that in that capacity once you've had that kind of training. Okay, so moving along, because we got a lot to cover. Okay, so if I go ahead and then I calculate that out, 34 divided by 21, it gives me an approximation of phi, the golden ratio. That is exactly 1.619047619, and I think we've talked about that. This is part of a looping number, so that you see how that 619 is already repeating. That if I kept letting this go out, you see a loop with that 619047, and then there's a whole thing about numbers that have that in it, but we won't get into that too much this time. But just know there's important numbers that do that sort of thing. And in this case, where the calculator cuts off at that number of digits, it gives us this sentence right here. So we've got alpha. So A is 1, F is 6. Okay, so alpha 904. That's IOD. So that's Yod. We got a 7. So we're going 7, 5. Okay, and then even though that's not spelled the PHI like Greek, it is understood on the on Wiktionary and the etymology that is just the spelling that another country uses for that same exact thing. So based on my expert opinion and looking at it or whatever, this is the solid translation. There is an alternative translation of that. It does have a word that means like non-Romany or non-Christian, but that's a whole other rabbit hole. But the important one that we need for the purposes of this workshop is Afa, which in addition to itself meaning like magic or divination in Igbo language of West Africa. As you know, among other things, I have the Igbo heritage. I believe that is from my mother's side, because I think most of my Nigeria stuff comes from my mother's side, whereas most of my like Cameroon, Bantu, and all that comes from my father's. All right, so anyways, in addition, Afa happens to be a language. So in addition to the more commonly used words that in Igbo language, there are these, I'm not going to call them primitive, but they're Afa words that are used in the divination system. So Afa is their equivalent to Ifa in the Yoruba tradition and Ava in the Dogon tradition. So it's all a similar system. They just may use like a different medium, but it's basically the same principle, which is essentially a quantum computing principles. It's astounding. Like, you know, these Westerners try to write off our West African systems as if they were primitive and blah, 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 but they're actually pretty advanced, numerically based quantum computing type of systems that a lot of the people who master those systems, they do go on to actually work on quantum computers. So, you know, Nigerians are killing it for that reason. Okay, so we got this programming system of language. Then Yod happens to mean hand. But in addition, it also means I or me, which is the ego. And this is all dealing with the personal consciousness. So now, just like we were talking about here, how we've got this interface with the hands that allows us to interact with the heart field. Now we've got this system Afa and the hand being mentioned. So we got an alphabet, and the hand having to do with the self. So all this is embedded in the same number. Now the other thing, so if I've got 12 sections on these fingers, that means between those 8 fingers, I've got 24. Now, if you look at my thumb, I've only really got 2 sections on each one. So if I add the 2 from this hand and the 2 from the other, well, do I have to? Let me look at it. All right, so basically we're getting into 28. So we'll get into the significance of 26 and 28, because there's a Masonic picture that floats around. It has 26 black tiles and 28 white tiles, and it has to do with the Tower of Babel. So this whole concept of the connection between the blood and the moon, because it's a 28-day moon cycle. But then we've got these 26 letters that correspond to not only our hands, but also to, remember I was saying about Dirichlet or whatever. So those D brains, the serpents, the snake, they basically make each one of the vibrations within the Calibre Yao space unique. It just happens to have the same number of those, numbered D0 through D25. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but then that's significant. We got the same number of letters as we do vibrations corresponding to 26 dimensions in the manifold of the subspace that helps weave together vibrations, the net, before things start to appear to us as matter. If you speed up a sound, like let's say like I'm spinning a high powered fan really fast, it'll go through sounds, but then after it gets to a certain speed, it'll start going through the cycle of the colors of the rainbow, and due to their heat and increase like any number of factors. So in other words, you can look at light as highly accelerated sound. And so that's kind of the significance of here, because we basically got vibrations that eventually are translated into things we can see and feel and touch. All right, so back up here. So the last part, so we've got the hand, we've got the self and the words, and now 7-5. So what is the significance of this? So we've got this golden ratio, we know kind of regulates the structure of our body. We've got all these different proportions. Now, mind you, the fingers themselves have golden ratio proportions to each other. That's why they're staggered in that way. And 7, okay, so in addition to being Allah God in the supreme mathematics, which breaks down to say God is a black man, Allah is God, always has been, always will be, the all-I-seeing. Let me say that again, the all-I-seeing. And all is 360 degrees, so we got a whole day. God is the wise man's equality. That is to build or destroy. And so down here we talk about that wise man's equality. That is to build or destroy. So it's telling you we're adding that 2 and that 6. Give you that 8, and I'll break that down a little bit more for you if you don't know the supreme mathematics and whatnot. Okay, we'll get back to that. But 7 also has to do with, so in the Hebrew, that has to do with sword or weapon, and sword is the symbol for intellect. So it's basically telling you that this has something to do with the system, the pressurized system that allows things to interact in a certain way. On the Arabic end of that, that is to purification. Okay, so we've got fire providing some kind of purification, which basically is to say we have a means by which we can translate the language such that it can interact with those vibrations on the quantum level, which also means that the system had to be dirtied or made impure so that it wouldn't interact with those vibrations. This is why several phrases and words in the Igbo language, especially in these Afa terms, they sound very similar to English words that have the same or similar meanings to what the Afa word is. And so, like my man's Darius J. Wright talks about in his out-of-body experiences, he's been to like the halls of Amenti and these different places, and one of the things that he learned was that there was an original language that is very much related to and similar to our English today, and the only difference is we pronounce it slightly different and spell things slightly different, but that's where the roots come from. And so the purification we're talking about is understanding the relationship between this golden ratio and our English alphabet. And so that's largely how we end up with a supreme alphabet of 26 letters, because those distinctions that we give for each one of those letters is closer to what the energy and underlying mechanism is for each one of those dimensions. So we'll get into that a little bit more. So if I do multiply 7 times the golden ratio, I cannot recall whether I chose to multiply 7 times the actual golden ratio, if I used it 7 times this. I believe I used 7 times this. Or whatever. I will double check that. I will give an update in the next video. But I believe, I would think that because it's relevant to this particular value, this particular estimate of 5, that I probably would have used that. But either way, you could try it on your own. If you don't get this number right here, this 11.32623792212, try it the other way. But then the one that's significant is this one. Okay, so we know how to do this. So 1s are A's. I got 3s or C's, but I got a 1 and a 3, so that could be a M. So the useful translation of this that I found is M, because in Egyptian, just M by itself with that little dash in front of it, pronounced it means to devour, swallow, or to know. So in other words, observation is the gathering of information, and in doing so, you're swallowing those signals. You're swallowing that information. This is what we're talking about with that Ouroboros, where everything that you're seeing, you're also projecting, which is the other meaning. When you combine the Arabic version with the Hebrew version, they come together for a meaning of projection. So if I got a purifying weapon, what I'm saying is I'm projecting something, a projectile weapon, like an arrow that's pointing out what it is I want to know. Okay. So we talked about the significance of the number 16, which keeps popping up. This 1 and this 6, and how it has to do with 1 is the crown, and then 6 being bodily chakras. We say that 1 is knowledge, 6 is equality in the supreme mathematics. Knowledge is to know, look, listen, observe, right? So observation. And also respect, a body of accumulated facts. So we're bringing together facts. A fact, a noun is a fact. A person, place, a thing. That's something that you can factually verify. That a person, place, a thing is also the definition of a cipher. So a cipher, a day, is a being. It's a person, place, or thing. A being. So an accumulation of beings. In the last video, I talked about how your soul is basically a composite of every single type of soul, every single species, whether you look at them as good or bad, you got them all in varying amounts. And so what's happening down here in the duat is that they're being woven together. Those vibrations are being woven together based on what your soul needs and what your soul contract is, but it's being made up of all these different races. And so depending on how you live your life is going to determine which one of their vibrations is more prevalent. And as a result, if you decide to pass on your DNA, have a child or something like that, they will take on characteristics more associated with the race, the soul race that you're vibrating like. And if you give that enough generations of that similar activity, your children will look more like one thing or another. They might start looking kind of reptilian. They might start looking more Pleiadian. They might start, these various things depending on those vibrations. Okay, and then that's what everybody's trying to get. They're trying to have a human experience, but then they want their particular race to be the souls that are running the planet. Okay, so there's a whole competition with all those different forces. So anyways, knowledge equality. So we say there's knowledge equality. Knowledge is to know the ledge of your equality. And this becomes important in a moment. I'm going to break this down. So know the ledge of your equality. Born to Allah God, the wise man's equality. So God is the wise man's equality according to the definition we gave earlier. And then we identified it has something to do with 26, which is zigzag zig, which is knowledge, wisdom, understanding. That's a complete cipher. But it also tells you that knowledge and understanding are alike, but then zag is unalike. So basically giving us this structure that will give us a torus shape, because an 8 ain't nothing but a sideways infinity sign, but we'll break that down a little better in a minute. Now, the significance of this whole knowing the ledge of equality, so the ledge, the edge of this equal, to be equal in everything in all aspects of life. Your equality only goes up to a certain degree, and then that's when you see the differences. So in other words, we all have a base level of code in our DNA that makes us all human. But then everything after that makes specific things like race and certain cultural features, like people from Indian tribes from South America all have a certain kind of nose for the most part, or whatever, that's easily distinguishable from an African nose in some cases. So these various features, even though they may be represented in one way, shape, or form in certain amounts in any race, they're very common and prevalent as a baseline commonality in certain genetic groups. Okay, so we go to the next letter. So I got a 2-6 and a 2-3, which I'm interpreting as Z and W. Now, I told you about that D with a diacritic. So that is actually written as a Z. So the Z, in a lot of, especially Afro-Asiatic languages is pronounced that DJ. It's understood that that Z looking thing is pronounced J. So that's where you can kind of hear how it eventually became Z, but originally it was like J, J, J. Okay, and so as a result, I'm interpreting that Z because they didn't have Z's in Egyptian. I'm interpreting that as a J sound, and so that gives us Jew. And we broke that down yesterday. So depending on which dynasty you were in, it meant two different things. Now you had evil, wicked, and then evil, like I've said before, comes from a etymology that actually just means beyond normal limits. So in other words, we usually consider something evil if it's going outside of what we consider the norm. So this is why I said this idea of knowing the ledge of equality. So what is outside of equality? Now, if you happen to be that person who, because you don't have the melanin or the genetics in order to take advantage of the paramagnetic abilities of melanin to connect with and imitate the field of the sun and its field, then, and if you, every time you went out in the sun, you just got burnt up, your skin wasn't trying to have no kind of communication with it. All it gave you was sunburns and cancer. Anybody that's not you, you would look at as evil, obviously. So there is an issue in mythology to where, depending on who it is that's writing the myth, they're going to make other people's out to be evil or bad because they're outside of their specific way of doing things. In fact, the word slave actually has to do with family or language, and it's derived from Slav, but then it was only called that because the people of Eastern Europe used a different tongue from the people of Western Europe, specifically Greek. It was the Greeks, for the most part, that coined this idea of anybody who's not speaking Greek is basically speaking wrong, and that's called slave language, according to Slav language, according to them. Okay, and if you look at the Slavic languages for real, you know, they're derived in many ways from Indo-Iranian, Cyrillic, all of that, which itself descends from both. Basically, it reveals the shared tradition between the Sanskrit and how it developed, as well as what I'm talking about with the Igbo language and all that. Like it's a place where phonetically these things come together with the Romani, aka Gypsies, and they're basically the bridge between their languages, the bridge between the Sanskrit vibrational language of southern India and the Romance languages, the like Latin and Latin based languages like our English, French, Spanish, English, French, Spanish, and Italian. Okay. Whew, now that we got through that. Okay, so in addition, depending on which dynasty it was, it also associated with that Jew with a pet, who was the snake that fights with Ra. And in the last video, we established that has to do with magnetic field, as well as the intestines and the absorption of vitamin D in the body. So our connection to the sun, you either getting your vitamin D from sunlight-based vitamin D, or you're getting it primarily from your diet. And so the best way in order to purify your relationship with that, and mind you, the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio has to do with winding. So this whole concept of winding that we have with serpents and snakes also applies to our intestines. And so you see how this theme basically repeats itself over and over in throughout the universe on every level and every dimension. Okay, so knowing the ledge of our equality is essentially saying what's going above and beyond that. I will demonstrate, is it on this one or is it the next one? I'll demonstrate in probably the next one the relationship between phi and the 360-degree circle, such that it allows things to extend beyond the limits of the circle, and interact with further dimensions, because that's essentially what's happening with these types of numbers. What do they call them? Non-terminating decimal numbers. I guess this one would be rational, because in that particular case, all right, I'll put it this way. So the Fibonacci approximation of phi is a rational number, because I can make a fraction that turns into that, but then the real phi is itself irrational, because there's no combination of numbers that you can divide that will give you exactly phi. You can get very, 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 very increasingly close, but then you can never get it exactly. Okay. All right, and so wise man's equality. Wise man's gonna come up in the next one in particular, because, mind you, the word wizard actually comes from a root meaning wise man, and then wise man is also the meaning of Homo sapiens. So Homo is man, sapien means wisdom. So wise man, wizard, Homo sapiens. So keep all that in mind. Keep all that in mind. Let's keep going. So we've got to know and devour. Then we've got this idea of evil, a pip. Remember back here when we were talking about Heret, we were talking about the hostile snake within the duots. All right, so this is a tummy ache basically. So you got two different types of ways that your intestines can work. You either giving them the good stuff and you switch to a plant diet and you feeding that part of yourself, or you eating the meat and everything else and you feeding those old instincts. So depending on which direction you go, depending on which way you eat, that's going to determine whether your body is more centered in its survival, primal, wild instincts, because your body's still an animal at the end of the day. That's the beast. Or is it going to eat like advanced beings or whatever, where it's taking in light, things like plants and fruits, things that have water in it. So you can look at your dry preservative type foods as being, on the bad side, and then your hydrating foods that don't rot in your system, like fruit, because fruits and vegetables pass through the system too quick to rot if you eat them raw. And so it's interesting, raw and sunlight, raw to God, and then raw vegetables. It's funny. Okay, so anyway, so moving right along. So we got devour or no. We've got evil or a pimp. Then we've got give, which is to either give, bend, or bind, or cross. And I've associated that with this nice little model here. So this little swirly thing right here. So apparently with magnetic fields, going down a vertical path of electricity, so it surrounds and meanders in a way, in a spiraling pattern down there, but it propagates out at the Fibonacci sequence. And it just so happens that between the two turns, 3 and 5, in this model I was looking at, they identified that as crossing through the center, the origin point of a coordinate plane. And that's important when you're talking about concepts of birefraction in light, where depending on how you have a crystalline structure arranged, it can take a single beam of light and then it will split it into two parts, one being the horizontal plane and one being the vertical plane. And apparently DNA does the same thing. And so because DNA has to do with memory, and we've associated memory with magnetic fields and magnetic field structures, it seems that this is a representation of how the Fibonacci sequence is informing that particular process and is an originating process. Okay. So we got this idea of either crossing, we got bending, binding, and something giving. So knowing the ledge of our equality when it comes to what's going on right here, meaning we got some means by which to interact with and understand what we're doing. This part is interesting to me because we got 1, 2 left, so that's AB. So Ab can mean shame, and that'll be important a little bit later. So either your stuff is gonna give you shame, which Ab in Egyptian make impure. So remember what we were talking about before, talking about this idea of eating the wrong stuff. We were talking about making the language impure, and then we've got the thing in the 1 to 36 in the 120 lessons where it talks about not being your own self due to the devil having you eat the wrong food. And we typically associate that with slavery, where they were forced to eat certain foods that weren't traditional to them or their systems, and the effect that had. But then even on this level, on the energetic level, we're talking about the having you speak a language that's not your own, because your language that's associated with your ancestors has specific vibratory effects on your body. And so they basically developed their English from your ancestral language, their Igbo or Kwa languages. So the Kwa language is all, because a lot of the words are the same in like Yoruba and other, or at least similar in other West African traditions. And so basically they turned your language into English so that they would have better command over it than you would. And then tell you that you ain't shit and you came from a bunch of superstition. So anyways, now the other meaning of that, it's related to a word for bending, which we have back here, but it also has to do with hippo, because it talks about Taweret, who is associated with that duat or the tawat, and represents the amphibians. So the whole concept of the amphibious being is that not just living on water or land, but being able to exist in wave form and solid form simultaneously. Because whenever we talk about waves and water in the myths, old myths, in most cases it's talking about the massless wave form, and then they talk about how things come into solid being. Like we've talked about how like Jesus is the solid form of what we were calling God in the Christian traditions, but they're all telling that same story of particle wave duality that people have gotten Nobel Prizes for. Complementarity, when you talk about Niels Bohr, you know what I'm saying? Nobel Prize winning stuff that came right from African teachers. So anyways, we've established that Tuat is also where we get Taurus. And so this concept is being preserved throughout this. So in other words, what you know beyond normal limits gives a Taurus, which is to say your thought is basically operating based on the principle of you being simultaneously here in the physical and in the non-visible, we'll say. Like there's information that you're pulling in with the right side of your brain subliminally, and impressions that you're getting from different waves and fields around you. But then there's the other stuff that is obvious to you that you see with your physical eyes and touch with your physical hands or whatever else. But your soul is always picking up way more and trying to find ways to communicate that with you. Okay. So we got all that contained in this number. So we've got that situation of how the motion, the twisting motion, and that connection of the gut and the brain coherence with the gut and so on and so forth, how that is also attached to the Afa, the language, the hand, and all of these have to do with the heart field. So these are 3 parts of the heart field, because in Chinese medicine, the tongue is an organ associated with the heart system. We already established that in yoga, the hands are part of the heart chakra system. And then this system right here is basically talking about the small intestine, what we use to absorb the vitamin D as well as the electrolytes and stuff that's largely facilitated by the small intestine, which is itself the yang organ of the heart system. So all three of these having to do with the heart. All of this having to do with the heart. This concept of the heart. Okay, they say that the 12 strings, so they're talking about these 12 serpents. They say those 12, so the 12 joints, there's 12 joints that they consider in Chinese medicine, and those are associated with the heart. The heart governs the joints. And then that goes back to what I was talking about with the mudras. So our joints are what we use in order to make the mudras. So that guides the way vibration moves through the body when we make sound. Now, I told you there was something interesting about that ob, because ob, of course, because it's 1, 2, we can interpret that as Aleph and Bet, the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which correspond to Aleph and Ba in Arabic. But these two, now we know for a fact in Arabic that the Aleph means Allah, and then just based on breaking it down, Bet, to house in, he who remains, which can translate to he who rests. It also translates to Romanian, apparently. It corresponds to Baal. So Baal is the storm god of a Canaanite storm god. He's in a couple other pantheons, but that's something like what Zeus is. But then Allah, on the other hand, corresponds to this, this 5-point sort of thing. So if you combine the two of them, we basically get that symbol, that pentacle, which corresponds to earth element as well as your inherent nature. So in other words, it's also the symbol for Shu, who I'll get into. So Shu is the god of air and wind in Egyptian pantheon, but more importantly, he connects heaven to earth. So he's basically the intellect, the system that connects the two things. Okay, and so when we have an enclosure, so if God, if we're going to associate him with the infinite, we have to create limiting structures in order to say this thing is this thing and that thing is that thing. And so that is a concept associated with Horus as well. Okay, and so we'll get into a little more detail about that. But it's your nature, and then we can take that to netter. Because remember, the one weaving the net. So the netter, which the Wapian folks would associate with Najaru, the overseers, our ancestors, the first beings that were here before all those other ones. And so basically what you're saying is, if you combine those two things, so we usually look at them as one, as Allah is the good and Baal is the bad. But that's kind of the point, because both aspects are placed within you for the sole purpose of you being able to work it out. So instead of you having to fight evil outside of yourself, you only are responsible for governing it within yourself, and then taming the animal, like teaching that animal to be tamed so that you can focus on spiritual ascension. So when we bring those two together, that one and that two, we can make that L, we can make that Lamed. So instead of 12 being interpreted as 1, 2, A, B, we can interpret that 12 as L. So you can already hear something right there. So I'm combining Allah and Baal to create El. So El in the Bible, typically presented as this person or this being who is both wrathful and giving and whatever else, just goes through the same type of emotions you and I do. They say made in his image, right? But anyway, so in Hebrew, Lamed is, it can mean teach, learn, or it can mean flame. And then remember, those Hebrew letters, those hand signs that Stan Tanner discovered had something to do with the toric field, electromagnetic field formed by fire. And then that fire is going to be important in a minute, because fire is a plasma. So plasma is charged particles. It is a fourth state of matter. So you got solid, liquid, gas, but you've also got plasma, which is all charged particles. Okay, and in the supreme alphabet, L is love, hell, right, and it basically goes into the relationship between the emotions as well as the relationship between the masculine and the feminine, because it's the feminine which presents the challenges that the masculine has to go through in order to be right and exact. And so what that translates into, because the feminine, we associate that with the space, with the actual physical forces, and we associate the masculine with kind of like a structure, a template that kind of forms itself around. The way our experience works is that we observe the space around us, the physical space around us, in order to understand our own structure and how we are able to interact with that outside space. So that translates on several levels. And then what do? If you look around your environment, there's certain challenges, then you adjust yourself in order to be able to address those challenges. But that's only possible if you've tamed that other nature, until you've tamed that set of circumstances and bodily limitations that you're given with physicality. So the idea isn't to try to escape from physicality or try to escape from your body, but to learn how to bring goodness into said body so that it can operate and align with those spiritual higher principles. God body, if you will. Okay, so L is understood to be one and the same with Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton. 4-letter word, 4-letter name. Now, in the Mormon Bible, they talk about how Yahweh and basically Christ are the same, one and the same, and are both creator and the avatar who came forth and, interacted with man. Well, there's continued stories that say that part of the reason that was like the incorporation of spirit and flesh and the bloodlines associated with those, he had to be born into a bloodline that connected multiple bloodlines so that he could clear up the karma for those. Because, like, for instance, if you leave it up to evil to fix itself, it's just going to keep on being evil. However, if you have quote unquote original sin, or you are like the ufologists would say, if you have a mammalian aspect to your soul, but then you also got reptilian in your soul, you're basically training the reptilian souls by the actions that you make. So if you live a good life and you overcome those urges, you're actually teaching all reptilian souls how to behave and how to act right and how to be functional members of the galactic society, if you will. So instead of you going out there trying to attack politicians or shoot lasers in space, get your own reptilian attitude right, and then if enough of us do it, that resonance from our collective field will do the rest. We talked a little bit yesterday about how, or it was either the previous one or the one before that, where we were talking about how avatars like Jesus appear based on the needs of the collective human field. So the collective human field knows whether it's leaning toward good or bad, and then it'll start affecting the DNA of those born such that they're born with certain qualities. And in that particular case, folks had strayed so bad that a child was born with a knowledge of himself and a little added ability that had to be brought out by him going through the initiations that were necessary. So anyway, so did I write the number? I did not. So interestingly enough, we talking about knowing the ledge of your equality and this concept of Yahweh, the He-Why. So in another video, I talked about this number 825 that shows up. So if you multiply the particularly the value of golden ratio associated with, I believe it was the 89/55 one. It was probably that one. But when you multiply the high, oh no, it was the 144. So we broke down 144 yesterday. So that value associated with 144 over 89, so which is basically so we associated that ADD to 144 with Joseph of the Old Testament, and then his descendant was Joshua, so Joshua. And so if you put 144 over 89, that 89 is Chai. So that H, if we're using a Het, so 8 is H, 9 is I. If we use that 8 as Het, whatever that sound, Chai is the Greek letter that symbolizes Christ. So they're basically saying Christ is a descendant of Joseph. And so that's similar to the New Testament story, but it's just told differently. So the New Testament is just the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament story. And so we've broken down in depth the relationship between that Chai and the Joseph as the tamer of the serpent, as the builder of the pyramid, and then you think of Christ, which means to rub, anoint, paint, to smear. So the whole idea of anointing. All right. And so basically we bring those two together. So we've got that symbol that can also mean the god of breath or the god of wind or air, Shu. All of these traditions start coming together when you understand it from this standpoint. So I can only have air and circulation, atmospheric circulation, if I create an enclosure like our atmosphere. So if you create an atmospheric enclosure, then the air is able to circulate, the vibrations are able to bounce around, you're able to make matter, so you're able to make earth in that way. So this is where you get this idea of creating the earth and creating man, breathing life into man. So Hiwa actually comes from Proto-Indo-European. Hewas, who is Vayu, the Hindu god of breath. And so Vayu, wind, the sky, god of breath. There's also Shu from the Egyptian. Shu is the father of Nut, who is the sky goddess, and Geb, who is the earth god. So we get An and Ki. An is sky in Sumerian. Ki is earth over there. So we put these together. So we've got this god of earth and sky. This could be pronounced as An Ki El. If you put all three of those together, An Ki El. That's where we get angel, because that G phonetically can pronounce as Ki. So they were interchangeable in their tradition. An Ki El. In the Terra Papers by Robert Morningsky, they talk about the Ankiel as Enki. He went to the Pleiades for a minute. He took some of his Syrian compatriots who had mated and blended with humans at some point, and that's where the Pleiadians came from. We talked about the Vega mysteries in the previous video. The Pleiades are associated with the feminine Vega mystery, so that means it deals with the dark-skinned people's mysteries, the information we had. The eagle became the same symbol as the Shabaz. So Shabaz in Persian means the crowned eagle or crowned hawk, crowned kite. So just those types of birds, which represent a spiritually ascended person. In contrast to a serpent, which is considered the word membrane. So it's basically the initial vibration, and then the eagle can be looked at as the ascended spirit. So after you've gone through that and you've incorporated said vibration. So this is why we look at angels as something that's high and elevated, because it's associated with that eagle, Pleiades, 7-star system, and the beings that they talk about being from them. So all Pleiadians are not white people with blonde hair and blue eyes. That comes from those who have Lyran descent that live there, but there's a wide range of beings soul beings and things of that nature associated with the Pleiades. So don't let some of these videos fool you. Okay. And significance here is that the Anki El are also said by Robert W. Smith, the author, to have been the ones who contributed the quote-unquote gift of the feather. And in the story by Robert Morningsky, he also talks about something similar. And it's basically what I was able to deduce is that I found out that the same gene that gives people of African descent curly hair is the same gene that allows scales of both fish and reptiles. It allows those scales to become feathers in birds. So when you have this idea of the feathered serpent that has something to do with Thoth and Hermes and all these folks are right here, it's talking about us. That we're the descendants of Thoth, who was known as Eri in West Africa. So we call them Umu Eri. And then the Eshi Umu Eri. That is where you end up getting Shumer, which became Sumeria in later pronunciation. So Shu Mer. Remember, Mer meant pyramid. So basically this temple of Shu, of the air, and that's what we are physically, is we're a temple by which air can come and spend a little time circulating through our system before we send it back to the atmosphere. And so that's how we communicate with it. That's how we exchange information with the atmosphere. And so this idea of God of breath is how it comes through all of this. So there's added significance to it. And we round in the bend. Now I'm going to give you a more thorough breakdown of this number right here and Enki's appearance in it. But the first few letters I want to look at is this. So you'll notice, okay, so we have E, N, H, K, I with those numbers right there. Now you'll notice traditionally Enki is spelled E-N-K-I in the Sumerian myths. So what is the significance of this H? Now, mind you, H, our eighth letter, depending on what language we're talking about. In Hebrew in particular, that H is chet. Chet. So it has that, so CH or KH. And similarly, if you take your H and you put a diacritic, a little curvy diacritic under it in Egyptian, it also gives you k. So that's where they got it from. Excuse me. So Enki. So it's two words, Enk and Ki. Or alternatively, Ankh. But I'll get into that in a minute. Now, the first one I want to point out, so with that pronunciation, that Enk, that actually means peace in Mongolian. Why is that significant? Because the Mongolians, so over in Mongolia, they also speak Cyrillic type languages. They say that is where the entrance to this legendary city in the sky, Shambhala, is lives. So you already see two names in there. You see Shambhu and Allah in there. Shambhu is an epithet for Shiva. Okay, and the other aspect of that is that they say that like those Vrils and those different people, like when the Nazis were trying to say that they were the Aryans and whatever else to some degree. Yeah, but that's only because they got some of our blood. But anyways, so they say that Kartikeya is their ruler. He's the Lord of Earth, which is a title that's supposed to belong to Enki. Well, Kartikeya is the son of Shiva and Shakti. So, or Shiva and Parvati, his wife. So the supreme being and his wife, which basically represents all the space and the forces, that is, and then Shiva is the destroyer and rebirther. So he's the resurrection. She's the space, the spirituality, basically. So it's basically the same thing as these two things coming together. So you can look at the Wedge, Ten Commandments, blah, 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 Shiva, which is why our fingers look like Shiva Lingam, which we talked about in the first video. And then the space, the time, the equator, if you will, the space allotted that has to turn through a day or whatever, you can look at that as the space. Those two things coming together are giving us this. Okay, so that's giving us some insight into this process that's being described by the two of them coming together and why the two of them together becomes the ruler of Earth, which is us. How do we know? Okay, so peace is Islam. Islam comes from that word, that peace. We understand Islam, I self Lord am master, to be mathematics. All right, so in 5% we understand it in this way: that peace is the absence of chaos, which is thus order. And then Islam is a natural way of life, which basically means I self Lord am a master. Like I control myself, I control my own body. If I choose to bow down to this, that's my business. If I choose not to, that's my business. If you break down Islam, you get Ish and Lam. Now, Ish, in several languages, including the Nordic runes, the Nordics descend from us West Africans. They were we were the first Atlanteans, and you'll see a lot of fish and mermaid imagery associated with that. I'll leave that alone for now, but that's deep. But the hybrids, because Anunnaki, whoever else is how the Pleiadians basically came about. They were mixing with us in West Africa, and then Inky took them away to the Pleiades, according to the stories. And so that word Ish means ice, and they were known as the ice giants, the ones that moved up to the Nordic region. And but ice is a state of matter where things solidify. Now, Lam is related to Lamed, and it means benevolent in Arabic, but remember it corresponds to Lamed, which was teach, learn, flame. So we're talking about that fire. So if you put those two together, we've got solidified fire. So what happens when you make fire solid? What does that even mean, to make fire solid? So it's got an electromagnetic field. Well, anything that you burn, it releases carbon, right? So and then carbon is associated with the earth element, but carbon is dark, it's black. So it gives off light when it's burning, but then everything burns black. So you're basically solidified fire. Your will is self. Okay? And so Shiva, another epithet of Shiva is Isha, which is, this is where we get Yeshua, Ishwa. So in other words, Isha, Shiva being the supreme being, Isha would be the solid form or whatever. So this is where we get these concepts of Jesus. So the whole story of Jesus is not to say that it's made up. It could have, the same thing could have happened many times, because the thing that we're distinguishing throughout this whole workshop is the fact that there's a single code. There's a whole system that's basically determining how the fields manifest, and ultimately how our physical reality manifests. Okay, so that idea of bringing together ice and flame, Isha and flame, Lam, also happens to be the seed sound of the root chakra, so the red chakra. Shiva tends to have to do with the throat chakra, the blue one. So we're bringing that blue and red together. So Islam is basically like bringing the Bloods and Crips together in peace. What? There it is, peace. Just an easy way to remember it. And then who always show up to have those little meetings between them? It'd be somebody like Farrakhan or somebody. So you got it literally playing out as Islam being the broker of peace between red and blue, between the throat chakra and the root chakra. And as I've talked about before, that's that means to activate like a cymatic plate type of situation, where if you're calm and you control your breathing and your eyes are closed, when you send sound with use the voice to send sound through the whole body, if you've got proper posture and everything else, you'll actually start to see mandala type shapes in the, like the little kind of static that you see automatically. The word for that is Eisengray, I believe it's called. but Eisengrau or something German. But when your eyes are closed and you see that kind of static, that and you see like the kind of floating type of forms or whatever, that, you know, until you start to fall asleep and dream, and it has clear pictures, you just kind of see that kind of stuff. Well, that starts to kind of organize itself. It's not something that's coming from your mind. It's actually just the because of the vibration going through your optical nerves, you're actually seeing those shapes. You're seeing that sound move through the water in your body, just like if you were to send sound through a pool of water. Okay, so that's that connection, to be able to see what's what in your body for real. And so we explained before how the square root of 2 is associated with that blue. Square root of 6 is associated with that red. And then when we divide those two, then we get Euler number, the Euler number associated with flow, with aerodynamics, fluid dynamics, complementarity between imaginary numbers and real numbers. So in other words, this is your bridge between the physical world and the spiritual world. And so this is also represented back in our diatom, because we've got the blue, which is on this side, which is on this cube, and then you got the red that reaches all the way to the other cube. So we've got blue reaching to the top corner of this 2D square. We've got red reaching to the top corner of this 3D square that is 2 squares out. So it's like a parallel world almost. And then we're learning the connection between those two, which, interestingly enough, if you look at those corners where the blue reaches versus where the red reaches, it has a line here that's equal to this line. So that's the yellow. So it's actually that solar plexus. And then that's actually how you connect these two, because when you're chanting Om, you're sending that sound into the solar plexus region, and then it connects to all the nadis, the energy channels, and then that's how it reaches the root and the crown and connects all of it at the same time. Okay, so there's some yoga here. Yoga means to unite, to bring together. And then, like I said, we're bringing these two things together. Now, I would have to look at this again, but a long time ago, I saw something that had me suspect that the human soul was largely based on the combination of the template of the angelic soul, as well as, well, whatever you would call it, the angel as well as jinn. So in other words, you had these two different creations, because remember, angels were supposed to be made with light, according to the Quran, and then the jinn were associated with fire. So here we had this fire. So in other words, Isha, we got the supreme being solidifying and being combined with fire, facilitating this process. So it's a good possibility that was the base template, because if you know anything about those two, and seeing you also got Ifrit that are associated with fire as well, that were made by, what's his name? Not Shaitan, but whoever. So we could play around with this, either Ifrit or the jinn or whatever that's representing fire in this case. And then you got well, they say the jinn served as our soul, so they lost their independent existence to a degree. You still have some that move independent, but then for the most part, you had ones that were serving as human souls. Like, I gotta go back and read through all of that again, but it's very possible that it might have been angelic form and then the Ifrit form that were combined together to make the jinn, and then the jinn were used as a soul's, at least a template kind of soul for the physical form that we would take once we were able to enter physical existence. So that'll be something to look into, and I'll let you know. But this Euler, so Euler is supposed to be pronounced Euler, and then we talked about how, like, it's not necessarily a thing. And one thing I want to tell you, like, in most of these cases, it's undeniable stuff that you could just see with the letters that are in the correspond to the numbers. But in a case like this, where I'm just making the observation that his name sounds like Euler, and then making that connection to Christ, because we know that has to do with the oil, the anointing, the smearing, or whatever else. And so I mean, it's very relevant here. I don't know if that was intentional or whatever, but it works very well as a device, a yantra, if you will, for being able to put all this together. Okay, so we talked about our boy Dirichlet. So the membranes that create words. So Dirichlet, his formulas, his things that he did have to do with creating a limit function. So in other words, if I got infinity, something going on forever, just like how the digits of 5 can be, I can limit that using this Dirichlet function. It's a certain way that you crystallize a number, quote unquote, by basically creating a infinite progression of dividing into itself. So when we talk about this whole concept of fractalization, where your body is ultimately a fractalization of a single strand of DNA, it's being multiplied over and over in the form of cells that then arrange themselves according to a predetermined template. Okay, well, a Dirichlet distribution, whatever it's called, is a combination of Euler's one of his formulas and a Mobius function. So a Mobius function is basically like if I took a strip of paper and then I twisted it and connected it at the ends, it creates one of these objects where as you move your finger along the surface of it, you end up inside, outside, because of how it twists. You've seen one of these things. And so that's exactly what we have going on over here. So we got the infinity sign and the way these colors are moving. And so how that infinity is being facilitated is that you have a Mobius function where you're flipping from one side to the other. So if I combine the Euler, the Euler thing that allows me to go back and forth between, to rotate back and forth between manifest and unmanifest, just like quarks, the smallest particles do anyway. And it's the same thing being represented by the sun coming up in the daytime and going away at night. It's this whole concept of being present in the physical world and then going out of existence and going into the nether world, or basically going from particle to wave. And so we are able to limit this so that we have a experience of infinity, but then we have a solid, stable, linear, open and shut, beginning and end moment. And without those moments, we cannot have memory. It's just everything happening at one time if you don't. So we've got this concept of union between the spiritual and the physical that's embodied by the Euler. And then we've got this Mobius. So this is what gives us eternal existence. And so this comes from the word, which is the Dirichlet. So these letters correspond to dimensions within the manifold, and Christ is the word. So it looks like we're on the right track. D-brain is word. Now, mind you, that serpent, we also mentioned that it has to do with that meandering. So it had to do with that winding of that spiraling of the magnetic field. And we talked about how, so this is called chirality. So when these two things, when the counterclockwise and the clockwise come together without canceling each other out, we call that chirality, which is what your hands have. So your hands, they look the same, but they're separate. It's two of the same thing based on the same one template, but just in reverse. And so there's a difference between a physical reflection, like in chirality of your hands, versus the illusion of reflection when you hold your hand up to a mirror. So the reflection is only a illusion of light bouncing off your hand, whereas chirality, you have two physical hands. So when we apply this idea of the meander, that means me going back and forth, back and forth. These are two sides to the same thing. So I'm going left to right and right to left. These are both happening at the same time. And then that gets into an Ethiopian concept of inner alchemy that I'll get into in another video. I'm actually still reading the book on that, and took interest in Ethiopian, teachings of that nature in the language and stuff, like through my investigations of this other stuff. But anyway, so that meander is associated with that in some shape or form. Well, that brings me to the bar of all bars. And you can look up this term, but magnetic confinement fusion. This is the concept that I am proposing. It has everything to do with how your soul works for the most part. So in addition to what we understand about this communication factor and where the alphabets actually come from, how we interact with those vibrations and the heart field, the significance of all of that being a torus is that what happens with magnetic confinement fusion is that, remember we talked about plasma and how that has something to do with fire, and we were trying to figure out a way to solidify fire, to be able to freeze fire in place. With Islam, with the mathematics, well, magnetic confinement fusion does just that. So they take a plasma made from I can't remember whether it was a hydrogen plasma, whatever type of plasma they use in it, and they apply a strong magnetic field to that plasma such that it is confined to a defined space in which those particles of that plasma, they flow in the form of a torus, so a donut shape, and they spiral, they meander perpendicularly relative to the electric field, the flow of the electric field that's running through that plasma. So this is exactly what you need. You need a structure, a magnetic structure that allows that fire, that plasma, those charged particles to circulate in a very defined manner. So the magnetic is basically given a geometric / mathematical structure to the flow of that plasma. And then that's where we get into those concepts of toroidal math and vortex math. Like they try to say that that's something fringe, but I've unlocked some amazing stuff using those concepts. Like once I understood it and applied it to everything else I know. But so look that up, and this basically explains how the soul can be looked at as the translator between spirit and the body. Spirit comes from a word meaning breath. And so breath isn't just air, but it's that circulation of the air. It's the interaction between microcosm and macrocosm. It is an electric related process, because when you breathe heavily, it creates static electricity, a static charge. And so magnetic fields and electric fields can exist separate of each other as long as they're staying still. But the second that an electric charge discharges and it's in motion, it creates its own magnetic field perpendicular to itself. So it's all about motion in this case. So these two things are separate. When the breath and the body, physical body, are separate, there's no motion. When the breath and the body are together, there's motion. This is why when you conduct CPR on a person, you're breathing air into their lungs and you're pumping that heart, because that combination of things creates that spark that allows that circulation to continue. But ultimately, your soul is the one that's facilitating the translation between those two things. So you've got certain charges, inherited catalysts that are contained in the physical body that you inherited from your environment. And then you also have spiritual, not the environment, from your ancestry. And in spirit, you have these charges that are associated with the physical space around you as well. And all the energetics, all the physical attributes, but then here's all the invisible attributes, the forces, all the stuff, we talked about melanin memory, and so there's a genetic memory, but then melanin memory is also associated with your body remembering its interaction with magnetic fields. So anything that causes melanin to gather, like whether it be a scar or just the heat from the sun, your melanin remembers that. And your melanin has the melanocytes, where your melanin comes from, has a crystalline structure. And those crystalline structures can hold those phonons I was talking about earlier. And those phonons can be created through sound being sent through the body in a specific way. So it's a whole communication system that you have with your body that basically allows you to project the information of your DNA into your mind so that you know some stuff. Okay, and then the soul, that's who you are. That's the eternal aspect of you. And so basically, in order to have the type of experience, this mortal experience that we're having right now, you have a fusion between spirit and body that is facilitated. Well, basically, you can look at it as taking two things, taking the ob as two separate things that really are representing one thing. So you are both things. You are both good and what you are considering evil, because what you consider evil ain't what everybody else considers evil. It is, you feel that it's evil because it represents the challenges and limitations. You look at evil as your border, your limitation. It's your limit factor, your Dirichlet, that allows you to have a mortal experience. Because when you're engaged in your eternal soul experience, like you do when you're having an out-of-body experience, you don't really have a concept of good and evil, because it's like you can't hurt anything and nothing can hurt you. And then you know everything and everybody else knows everything too, for the most part. Like your frequency and your beliefs that you're holding on to could limit the way that you experience it, but there is no inherent limit to your access. But at the same time, the more spread out you are, to where you lose your singular identity, it's going to be an entirely different kind of experience for you. But that is the overall process. So we basically taken it from whatever's going on with the frequency of the pyramid. We took it from these lines that are occurring in that phi ratio when we meander it. And then it takes us to this concept of magnetic confinement fusion, which may explain exactly what our heart field is doing, such that it is guiding the plasma makeup of ourselves, because we even use the word plasma in our blood, right? So your heart and the veins and stuff are directing which way that the blood flows. But even on an electromagnetic basis, there's magnetic field lines that are holding the charged particles of your body in a particular position. And the second that the heart stops, it stops projecting that field, and then naturally those charged particles are no longer held in place. And so you breathe out for your last time, and those particles just go wherever they go. Well, when particles have been following a particular path for a super long time, they tend to continue to use those kind of patterns. So sometimes when we see things like ghost apparitions, stuff like that, it's basically energy following the same pattern that it has for many, many years. And so all of these concepts help you to start kind of bridging the understanding of how you can have a soul that lives on and can still have a physical experience, because it still has that memory, it still has those connections of charges. The difference is when you're living and awake, you just happen to have materials from the earth arranged in that particular arrangement according to your magnetic field that you're emitting. So now we're basically starting to take out some of the foofy, starting to see how these things connect, and how there's a mathematical basis, a scientific basis to spirituality, and vice versa. There's a spiritual aspect to the mathematics. And now this, if you haven't listened to the latest deep dive, episode 8, where they're talking about how these ideas that were presented by this guy, Gobineau, back in the early 1800s, laid the foundation for a lot of the beliefs in Germany about initially the soul races, but then you had the Nazis that basically made it about physical race. And in some ways that's not wrong, because what your physical self looks like is just a projection of the experiences of your soul. And they took some liberties in certain ways with trying to make themselves out to be, better than everybody else. But we know the score. And now we're giving you tools on how you can see the truth for yourself, because it doesn't make sense how much sense this makes, and me not having to try to make it make sense, but then just following the mathematical structures that are appearing, like just looking at it, like, because sometimes I'll look at these numbers and then words will appear and I don't recognize the words, but then I'll look it up on my Wiktionary and then find out it's an actual thing. And then when I put the words side by side, it ends up having something very relevant. And in the vast majority of these word combinations, they tend to have something to do with this, the stuff that's on this particular board. It's usually pointing to like the toroids and the vibrations. So it's basically telling you how everything manifests, how it comes into existence and out of existence. And then it's also showing us the language interface by which we as humans have been able to describe that exact process, that physical process, in various stories and different ways to help us remember. Because remember, magnetic fields and memory go hand in hand. So that's essentially what we're doing when we're creating stories. Like myth is a storage device that when you learn it, it activates certain pattern recognitions and things within your body, and it starts unlocking the memory of those pattern recognitions in your DNA. So if you had certain abilities in a previous experience of your soul, this is how you end up accessing it, by reminding yourself through the stories that we create and that we listen to. And so on that note, I'm going to go ahead and end it here. We'll pick up with this line. We're still dealing with line 16. Inky, we just got to the ink. I ain't even get to the key. But I will break that down in the next one. But you got some understanding of where the key is, and the Anki and the Ankiel, and then Ankh is peace, and so on and so forth. But we'll continue on the next one, y'all. All right, let me flip my joint. Peace.